Good, well, welcome everybody to this discussion meeting on China's evolving relationship with North Korea. And I think what we want to do in the next hour or so is really establish what is the essence of this relationship and what is the direction of travel within it. For instance, does China have an instrumentalist approach towards North Korea, seeing it as a useful buffer against the US and its East Asian allies, and regarding it also as a chip in its effective control and possession with respect to much longer range, longer term calculations about the kind of Sino-centric Korean peninsula that China presumably wants to see emerge? Or is China a captive of North Korea, the ultimate neighbor from hell, against which you can occasionally slap an ASBO, but is essentially unreformable and uncontrollable, a reputational and a strategic liability that, however, if it were to be cut loose, would become even more dangerous to many of China's vital security and economic interests, and something that in any case cannot be simply wished away. And as far as North Korea is concerned, does it see China as the ultimate kind of sugar daddy, the provider of strategic comfort, of economic life support, or is it a big brother figure, overweening, presumptuous, the source of endless boring lectures about the need for structural reforms, and a power against which North Korea has a strong interest to import some counterweight, including possibly by the establishment of a deal with the United States that would confirm North Korea's independent stature in some way? Or is it, as I personally suspect, all of the above, all at once, and all of the time? Now, we've got three people here who follow the situation much more closely than I do, and they're going to speak in the order in which they appear on the schedule. Dr. Laura Salmon, who's an associate at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy, based in Beijing. Dr. Adam Cathcart, who's about to take up a post at the University of Leeds here in the UK, and is currently at Queen's University Belfast, an editor of a blog on Sino-North Korean relations, and also from the Institute, a research assistant attached to our non-proliferation disarmament program, Nathan Beauchamp Mustafaga. They'll speak each for about 10 minutes on the record, and then we'll devote the rest of the time to Q&A. So, Laura, welcome, and over to you.
All right, great. Well, thank you all for coming. I'd like to express my thanks to the International Institute for Security Studies for having me, and also to Mark Fitzpatrick for making this all happen, and of course to our esteemed chair for today. I will be addressing essentially whether or not China, from within China, whether or not the idea that they've actually conducted an about-face on North Korea, whether or not this has actually happened. And in doing so, I will be tracing a series of events which have heretofore been used as milestones or markers to punctuate a shift, this idea that China's approach towards North Korea is changing, and I will challenge them. My basic contention is that while there's been an effort in Beijing to be more active, and active is a term used by Chairman Xi Jinping when he's referring to the role that China wants in the world on North Korea, and there have been some contributions to this effect, I would argue that much of this is based on its response to Washington's criticism of its level of efforts in the past, and not necessarily at this issue of proliferation itself. And because of this, I'm not convinced that it will lead to drastic results. So what I'm going to do essentially, rather than tracing the entire history of this issue, which I think you're probably all aware of, is start off from the nuclear test that was conducted this year in February, the third nuclear test. And I'll be looking at the actions that China has undertaken. Now, when the test initially was undertaken within China, I think that there was a certain amount of frustration among experts because, in largest part, it was in close proximity to the Chinese border. It was less than 100 kilometers. It came on the third day of the Chinese Lunar New Year, so that was also very symbolic. But the question is, did this test mark a major shift or incident for China? Now, Beijing, essentially, as we all know, did support UN Security Council Resolution 2019 on the third nuclear test. But I would argue this is not necessarily representative of new behavior. It also supported UNSCR 2087, having to do with the rocket launch, and it took them, I might add, a while to support that. They were very much adamant that that December 2012 test was actually for civilian purposes. I know because I was part of that discussion in China. China has also agreed in the past to UNSCR 1874 after the second nuclear test in 2009. They agreed to UNSCR 1718 after Pyongyang tested a nuclear weapon in 2006. And in that point, actually, when they first conducted a nuclear test, they used a term which, when it's used at the official level, is usually reserved for the United States or other parties. They used the term Hanran, which is basically wanton or brazen act. So actually what I've seen is a dilution over time of this reaction within China. And so, as we all know, there have been questions as to whether or not they're enforcing these sanctions. The second event that I would like to point out in February was Beijing summoned the North Korean ambassador to its Ministry of Foreign Affairs to protest this third nuclear test. But once again, I would argue this is hardly new. For anyone who observes what's happening within China, this expression of discontent behind closed doors is fairly regular. What is different, perhaps, is the fact that it's occurring more visibly. You know, it's almost as if it's putting on a show. But once again, who is that show for? Is it for North Korea or is it for the United States? Is it for Washington? And once again, I would argue that Beijing seems to be responding more to Washington than it is to Pyongyang or any case of proliferation. If you're interested in this, I have a Carnegie paper on this called Balancing Chinese Interests on Iran and North Korea. May. I'll take you to May, because I think May has been pointed to as a month in which China's sea shift was occurring, right, on this issue. The Bank of China announced its closure of the North Korean foreign trade bank accounts. You may also remember that this was the month that Beijing also had to contend with kidnapping of its fishermen in that 10-day standoff. Once again, this was pointed to as this milestone. And while I think within the West there was obvious symbolism for what occurred, China continues to abide by this idea of economic integration with North Korea. I have not seen any change in that regard. All of the discussions within the country are about how to integrate it, how to develop ideas of special economic zones for it to develop in the way that China has developed. That's why you've seen leader after leader being taken to these SEZs. There is still an interest in establishing an SEZ near Dandong within China. It's also unclear as to whether or not the money that was in these foreign trade bank accounts was actually even present when they closed. North Koreans, as you probably know, have been limiting their transactions in major banks within China for quite a while. And on this point as well, third countries are often used for transactions as well as provincial banks within China, much smaller banks, to avoid this scrutiny. And in fact, a number of not just smaller banks, but also state trading companies have actually benefited from this closing off of this avenue in these major banks that never really existed to begin with. Most of the North Korean trade circumvents the banking system and actually can occur in form of barter, trade, gold, gemstones, trading companies. All of these subsidiary companies that you hear of within China. Now, I'd also like to point to the fact that this Bank of China's move coincided with South Korean President Park Chung-hee's visit to Washington, where China already knew that North Korea would be very high on the agenda. So once again, who is the audience here? I still argue that it's for the United States largely. And China's cooperation largely has not discontinued, despite all of this discussion. If you look at commercial satellite imagery, this came out of the International Crisis Group in Beijing. They have said that there's signs that there's still accelerated development of the two islands economic zone, which is the Hwanggyumpyeong and Wihua Islands. It's located in that district, and it's near Dandong, despite reports that actually this has been closed down. There's a $6.3 billion project. I could actually go on and on. I know I only have 10 minutes. 61-mile transmission cables to Hunchun. There's a $490 million fund to invest in North Korea that came after Kim Jong-un's uncle made a visit to Beijing. I would argue that, once again, this is not new behavior. You know, in the past, these exports have continued. June. I'll take you to the last two sets of actions. In June, the North Korean First Vice Foreign Minister Kim Gae-kwon and Chinese Foreign Vice Minister Zhang Yesui met. And this was just following Pyongyang's offer for direct talks with the United States and visit to Beijing by top envoy Vice Marshal Cho Rong-hai, who said that Pyongyang was willing to take active measures to return to the talks. But once again, this marks nothing new, I would argue. The six-party process, as we've seen, what China has actually said that they are pushing them towards to re-engage in these discussions has actually been languishing for a long time, as we all know. Chinese experts that I have dealt with just after Kim Jong-il's passing said that they were very pessimistic about the prospect of talks being able to succeed in the future. So already there was a pessimism going into this. This 180 turn is actually very recent, and I don't think it actually represents, first of all, anything new, and secondly, a lasting approach. And in June, another, and the final milestone I will point to, was the first strategic dialogue between the Chinese and the DPRK foreign ministries. But the Ministry of Foreign Affairs within China has been mostly relegated to a subordinate and implementation role within the country. The Communist Party of China's Central Committee's International Liaison Department, a very long name, is in charge of the party-to-party diplomacy within the country. They are the ones who are calling the shots, and the People's Liberation Army is the second arm of all of this. So I think that it's important that we bear in mind the MFA does play a role, but it usually is secondary. They are still listening to their superiors. So in conclusion, what is the bigger question here, I think, is does China have the impetus to act? I talked about all these actions, right, all these activities, but I think that we have to really evaluate whether or not it's in China's interest to do so. And at one level, and this is something I point out again and again, there is a recognition within China that the DPRK faces much of what China sees itself as having faced historically, including a worsening asymmetrical security environment, foreign efforts at containment, cyber attacks, nuclear and conventional coercion. They refer to all of this when they're talking about North Korea as a victim. There's still a large amount of this victimization dialogue going on within China. For example, there's much more coverage of these cyber attacks that were supposed to have occurred against North Korea than necessarily any of these other actions that I've talked about today within China. That's what the Chinese are talking about, is North Korea as a victim. And also, I think there's an understanding that within China, that North Korea is seeking to mitigate U.S. pressure, enhance its deterrence, stability, self-protection. Another point I'd like to point out is that they're using terms like 自卫. 自卫 is self-protection in Chinese. It's exactly how the Chinese describe their own nuclear arsenal. They continue to use that term. So when they're talking about another party using the same terminology that they apply to themselves, we should be paying attention. There's also a discussion within China that until the United States changes its tact, that this will not be resolved. They're still they're foisting this on the United States and forcing North Korea's pursuit of nuclear weapons, 被迫, which is another term, this idea that they're being forced down this path. Who else do they apply that term of being forced down the path towards nuclear weapons to? Themselves. This is something that historically Chinese experts and government have used even in official documents to refer to their own pursuit of nuclear weapons in the 1960s. So I'd say we have to pay attention to this inherent empathy. It's what points to where China is headed on this issue and why there has not been a major shift. So I think that this conflicted sense of what the United States is pursuing, and I wanted to wrap up by pointing to actually a comment that came out from Xi Jinping that is also marked as another milestone. It was at the Boao Forum in April of 2013. He said, "No one should be allowed to throw a region and even the whole world into chaos for selfish gains." It's widely assumed he's talking about North Korea. However, I would argue that given the U.S. deployment of B-2, B-52 bombers to the region, he was not only talking about North Korea, but also the United States. And that idea that it is using North Korea as an excuse for ballistic missile defense, for rebalancing to the Asia-Pacific region, for all the things that we're talking about today. So I just want you to keep all that in mind in trying to reorient how we look at this issue and whether or not China's activity or engagement on this will be lasting. They're compelled to interact with the United States, but I would actually say that for them, it's seen as a lose-lose scenario, not a win-win one. If the DPRK issue is resolved, it means greater U.S. presence and expanded leverage. If it's not resolved, it means greater U.S. presence and strengthened alliances. So I think that within the country, all I see is a conflicted approach. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the comments from other panelists.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Not a rosy picture.
Sorry.
Adam, do you agree?
Yes, I agree with all of it.
Oh, what a shame.
Actually, I'll disagree with a few points,
Okay,
but
great,
that'll
great.
be in my
Go ahead.
presentation. Well, thank you again for the welcome. Glad to be here and looking forward to discussion. So I'll try to keep my remarks quite brief. When we look at North Korea, I think it's, in particular the North Korean-Chinese relationship, there's one absence in that relationship and in the Chinese discussion of that relationship and in the whole discourse, and it is this phrase black box. There is very little mystery, I think, in the PRC about how to deal with North Korea, what it is. I was at a conference not too long ago, 2 months ago, I suppose, in Oxford, and just prior to that conference, I was watching a U.S. Institute of Peace conference, and we had a Chinese think tank scholar basically saying, it's Kogoryo all over again. We have to go back to the 7th century. What if the Uyghurs get a hold of a North Korean nuclear weapon? So, and that's a very a comment that needs to be contextualized. China's seeing North Korea in literally, centuries long terms in terms of how it contextualizes North Korea. So I'm a fan of this kind of Sinocentric approach, and I think it's really worthwhile. But it's also important to note that there's a massive amount of data beyond the historical and in the contemporary when we look at North Korea. And my remit this afternoon is to talk about the Dandong Special Economic Zones, the Hwanggeum-pyeong and the Huihua Islands. That's basically my task. So my work there is historical. I'm primarily a historian. I work in archival documents in the Chinese Foreign Ministry and in the American archives, etc. And so I'm trying to put it into long-term context. At the same time, I think it's also important to do field work. I'm a fan of satellite photographs, but it's quite possible to go to Dandong quite easily. It's easy to go all up and down the border. And there's much more to the border than just Yanbian and North Hamgyong province and defector narratives there. And there's much more to the economic relationship and the ups and downs of it all along the border, both legal and illegal trade, than simply Dandong. So what I'm going to present is kind of a small portion, but a very important portion of that of that relationship and of that context. Few kind of contextual questions here, or facts rather. 80% of bilateral trade goes through Dandong and Sinwiju hub. There are more North Koreans, according to the Chinese Foreign Ministry, living in Dandong than any other city in China. It's a small city, but more North Koreans there than in Beijing and Little Pyongyang, which hopefully if people have had a chance to walk around the North Korean embassy there. It's a lot of fun. Sinwiju is, of course, one of the largest cities in the DPRK, and I think this really affects how North Korea looks at this particular special economic zone. And it's not simply one of the biggest cities. It also has a history of rebellion. In 1945, you had a student revolt, kind of mixed in with landlords and Christians, which I've written about in the Journal of Korean Studies, and even going back to the Tonghak Rebellion in the 1890s. So this is a very, very important nexus, but it's one that is sort of not so much trusted by the center in Pyongyang. Finally, it's a symbol of friendship. The Chinese People's Volunteers left in 1958. They went through Sinwiju. There was a big parade. It hasn't happened much since. But it's a very natural place for China to leave an imprint of aid and of relationships on all levels, propaganda, military, etc. That would be a restoration if we see China coming in that fashion and working in Sinwiju. It's nothing new. This is simply a restoration of the way the relationship was, not simply during the Korean War, but prior to the Korean War. Kind of a harmonization or a rebalancing, to use a local term, to localize a term rather, for the border. On the Chinese side, on the macro system, I think it's important that when we look at Chinese investment in the frontier, its view of the SEZs, its entire approach to the DPRK and the frontier, that we put it in context. Sometimes these are very unique things that are done because it's North Korea, because there is a special relationship. Other times you have the larger questions coming into play, how to develop frontiers in a prosperous way. There are a lot of documents coming out of Beijing about this, cracking down on illegal cross-border trade all over the PRC. Benefiting from transportation linkages. China's building a high-speed railway to the North Korean border. They're building those railways to all their borders. And so, how unique is this? I believe those railways make North Korea pretty nervous, actually. Frontier defense is another one. But the special economic zone near Dandong, and it's Hwanggeum-pyeong and Huihua, but I'll simply call it Dandong or Sinwiju, is unique because it is braided into this bilateral relationship, and it's a product of the relationship, and it's a representative symbol of the relationship in a way that Rason can't be, because Rason is sort of ahistorical in a sense. From the North Korean side, their fears and their worries and their hopes for this special economic zone, I think it's very important that we look at legacy politics. For whom is this a legacy? Scholar Hyuna Kwan at Cambridge has a great book about North Korea's charismatic politics. It's highly, highly recommended because one of the things that that book asks us to do is what is the imprint of Kim Jong-il and what is the imprint of Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung had no interest in developing Sinwiju as a cross-border trade site. He had no interest in developing special economic zones. He thought that North Pyongan province, which is where this SEZ is located, was a granary, and this is where you go during a war, right? And he wanted to build up Kangye, which is further from the Chinese border, as his ultimate defense post, and Kim Jong-un likes to go there. He likes to go down into the tunnels, if we read our arms control blog, Jeffrey Lewis. His commissioning essay is very interesting stuff about that. Kangye is a center, but you don't go to Sinwiju. Kim Jong-un does not go to Sinwiju. He doesn't bring his bodyguards there. Pak Pong-ju does not go to Sinwiju. He goes to North Pyongan, but they don't go there. And it's not simply the special economic zone. They're not going to the city because it's potentially seditious, I believe. So when we look at Sinwiju, why? Why Sinwiju? It's Kim Jong-il's imprint. This is a Kim Jong-il project. So you had this abortive attempt with Yang Bin, this Dutch flour magnate, not grain, which would be not flour from grain, not wheat flour, but tulips and such, which was aborted in 2001, 2002. But we have an accelerated that came back in 2010 and 11. And is this a Chinese initiative or is it a North Korean initiative? And of course we won't know until we get into the archives. But I see Kim Jong-il as being really having accelerated the progress with China in 2010 and 2011, the aftermath of the Wen Jiabao visit, of course, in October 2009. So if we're looking at our chronology, Kim Jong-un got very interested in meeting with the Chinese. Incidentally, when Li Keqiang went to Pyongyang, he's the most high-level person who's met with Kim Jong-un, who's still active, not Zhou Yongkang, who's supposedly out of the loop and is getting further out of the loop in Beijing. But Li Keqiang did not have a private meeting with Kim Jong-un, even though supposedly, the Kim Jong-il's will had been written only 2 weeks before. And if you've handed the keys of the car of state to Kim Jong-un, you'd think he would have a moment to sit down with Li Keqiang. He's actually not at the table when they're having their meeting, according to the cameras. So this is a Kim Jong-il project, and the accelerated relationship with China, I would argue, was Kim Jong-il's doing, and was done with his assent, rather. What is North Korea getting out of the special economic zones there? They're getting the fact that China will bankroll it, so why not? Secondly, there's a potential for new banks, and we talked about banks and is there money in the accounts and such. Buried in the fine print here is that you can set up international banking. This could be a perfect place to launder funds, of course. And third, no passport controls to get in, allegedly, from the northern side. So this is potentially ideal. So you close all the doors, but this window is absolutely open. It's gaping, in fact. And number three, it kind of anchors the Chinese in what I would call kind of a defensive capitalism model. It's the same way that the Moranbong band, it's a girl band in Pyongyang, is defensive culture. You sort of set it, capitalism is it's pressing in on you all the time. You push back a bit by sort of adapting it and changing it and saying you're playing along, but in fact it's under your control. So this is how I would argue. The mosquito net, not so much, because Sinwiju is too close. Just a few more points to make. Kim Jong-un has obviously, these things have not gone very well since he came to power. The overall relationship is in a rut. We've seen a slowing of Kim Jong-il's Cholima speed that he applied to Sino-North Korean relations. And most importantly, and as I'm sure most of you know, there's been explicit strife about Chinese businesses in North Korea. Now, do the Chinese believe in the Dandong project? Are they pushing for this? Is this China throwing its weight around on the frontiers? If you dig down a little bit, you'll see that they're not very hopeful about it, and it's moving quite slowly. There was a very important article in Shizhe, which is the foreign ministry magazine, in 2011, published about setting up a North Korean Hong Kong. Great headline, always the headline, very optimistic. You get into the guts of the article, it says the place will flood. And I was there in Dandong in 2010 when it flooded. It was atrocious. I mean, it was a horrifying place to be. Dandong is in a precarious situation during a flood, but Sinwiju has very little protection, and these islands have even less. The North Koreans since then have set up a few paving stones along Huihua Island. That's the extent of what they've done. And Chinese know that this is a multi-million-dollar project. If you can't protect this, you're never going to set up a factory on there. So there's massive plans, and we all know how wonderful it is in China to look at a chart and to look at drawings of a region. But the reality is that the bridge is moving pretty slowly, and there's fear about flooding. The North Koreans are still feeding Sinwiju from that land. So you can't build factories on it until you stop the farmers and you kick the farmers out. The last time I was there, which was less than a year ago, the farmers are still working the land. And again, that's a Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il split. Kim Il-sung explicitly said in his 1964 rural theses, which have come back via the Byungjin policy in a big way. So the rural theses are living with us now in North Korea. You don't move farmers off of land. You know, you can develop cities, you can develop the economy, but you don't take people off of food production. And they have yet to do that. And that is another necessity before this thing actually moves forward. Finally, I would just say beware sources and beware the Chosunilbo in particular. April rolled around and there were a lot of things happening, and the Chosunilbo had a headline that said Chinese capitalists are in disarray. There are more than 100 of them, or almost 100 of them in Pyongyang trying to get their money back. They've all been disappropriated. They're living in hotels, sort of day to day, trying to sue the North Koreans to get their money back. What a wonderful headline. What an interesting story. Very compelling, 100 Chinese capitalists holed up, in the tower of Pyongyang. And there they were. Unfortunately, that was published in a Chinese newspaper, Chongqing Zaobao. They totally mistranslated it. That was true in 1993. And the whole article was about how the good old days are over. So, Chosunilbo kind of got the idea that Chinese capitalists were having a tough time. Unfortunately, the information is literally 20 years out of date. So, buyer beware when it comes to these special economic zones.
Great. Thanks very much, Adam, for setting out some of the web of political and other motives that are inherent in some of these forms of economic interaction between China and North Korea. Nathan, how would you draw the strands together for us based on your own research?
I guess I'm batting cleanup duty here.
Yeah.
So I'm going today to talk about this shift, not in terms of the macroeconomic or macro-political issues, but actually try to bore down a little bit and talk about something within the Chinese system, the bureaucratic politics of China's policy. So much has been made about the apparent shift under the new president, Xi Jinping. Many former U.S. officials, including John Huntsman, Christopher Hill, Kurt Campbell, and even President Obama, have made comments to the effect that they believe they are seeing a shift in Chinese policy. However, I think as our two former panelists just said, there are reasons to doubt whether or not this is actually happening, whether or not we should be excited about this possibility. So Chinese bureaucratic politics is kind of an interesting issue, as China sees North Korea as a black box. Many in the West and outside of China see China's policy itself as a black box, but it is possible to actually bore down inside and understand what is going on. So my topic conversations today have been based on about 70 different interviews with U.S. and Chinese individuals from the military, from academia, and policymakers in between both governments. So I think that China's policymaking for North Korea is best characterized as bifurcated policy management, in the sense that there is increasingly centralized decision-making at the highest levels of the Chinese government, but there is increasingly diffuse implementation from many actors within lower levels of the Chinese system. China's policy is grantedly opaque, so many Western observers generally look at the top leaders. But we'd like to understand this through the top leaders, but often we have to resort to examining other actors as reflections of top leaders' decisions. However, this time, following the third nuclear test in February, we did have direct quotes from Xi Jinping and new Premier Li Keqiang that Laura mentioned. However, obviously, the debate is whether or not they were specifically mentioning North Korea, because they did not name them directly, but whether or not this was also partly directed by the United States. This is a very important issue. So I think that we need to look at the different actors within the Chinese system and examine their own interests in North Korea and how they could possibly support or oppose this policy shift and how this would impact overall policy. So China's policy and the actors within that are divided into, I would say, tiers of influence. There are two final decision-making bodies within North Korea policy. The primary and final arbiter of China's policy is the Politburo Standing Committee. This is the Xi Jinping level of government, the top 7 leaders within the Chinese system. They're the ones who ultimately make the decision for North Korea. However, these decisions are based on recommendations from the Foreign Affairs Leading Small Group, which is kind of the general organizer and coordinator between the different interests for the Chinese system. Primary stakeholders with the most influence over Chinese policy, as Laura briefly mentioned, is the International Liaison Department, which is responsible for party-to-party relations, not only with North Korea, and traditionally as communist parties in general around the world, but now even relations with the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in the United States. The People's Liberation Army and the Chinese military, responsible for military ties, and you have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is responsible for government to government, and generally the external facing side of the Chinese government. Secondary stakeholders with limited direct influence into the policy decision-making process, but massive responsibility for implementing overall policy include the provincial governments of Jilin and Liaoning, the Ministry of Commerce, the Ministry of Public Security, and Chinese businesses themselves act as kind of a conduit for interests, including both the state-owned enterprises and private companies. Peripheral stakeholders that influence the debate but do not have specific direct input into the policymaking process, most commonly looked at is the academics within China, but I would also suggest that Chinese netizens are an increasingly important factor in China's policy. These actors come together to create several different dynamics for China's policy, including inter-bureaucratic convergence, intra-bureaucratic competition, central-local conflict, bureaucratic inertia, and Chinese policy toward North Korea as a reflection of its own domestic politics. So look at a couple of these actors specifically. If there was indeed a shift made, it would likely be at the highest levels of the Chinese government. This is the Politburo Standing Committee. This would be with Foreign Affairs Leading Small Group input. Such a high level of involvement is needed because of the massive bureaucratic inertia caused by this bifurcated policy management within the Chinese system. I would suggest that if Xi Jinping were to actually dictate a shift in policy, if it were true, would likely be for three possible factors. One would be bargaining leverage in the U.S.-China relationship. Two would be a revised threat perception of China's own security vis-a-vis North Korea. And three, a revised cost-benefit analysis of China's support for North Korea. I would suggest that it's most likely the third one. Xi Jinping, however, has incentives to not pursue a dramatic change in Chinese foreign policy overall. He has himself started a big anti-corruption campaign at the outset of his term. He has worked to reinforce the party supremacy, which is a challenging task in China, and is most importantly expected to unveil much needed economic reforms this fall that will take much of the regime's attention going forward. So such a shift in Chinese foreign policy would be an added and possibly unnecessary risk for his overall transition into power in the Chinese system. And it would be Xi Jinping's first major foreign policy act outside of the U.S.-China relationship. This would be a big gamble for him. The Foreign Affairs Leading Small Group coordinates interests for the different Chinese actors and is technically led by Xi Jinping, but generally managed day-to-day by the new director, Yang Jiechi, who is importantly from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. His predecessor was Dai Bingguo, who's from the International Liaison Department. And as Laura said, the International Liaison Department is generally seen as more favorable to North Korea. So this is an important fact that the Foreign Affairs Leading Small Group may indeed be shifting more toward a U.S.-centric or kind of a more U.S. ROK perspective on North Korea. However, important to note, within the Chinese system, individual connections, guanxi, make so much of a difference. Yang Jiechi is generally known as weaker than his predecessor, Dai Bingguo. So this is an important thing to watch of how well he can actually coordinate interests in his own perspective for maybe a more U.S.-centered approach. The International Liaison Department, as responsible for party-to-party relations, is the most influential actor for Chinese foreign policy toward North Korea. And importantly, to Adam's talk, supports North Korea's economic reform, in part for the CCP's own legitimacy at home. Thus, it is unlikely to support a shift at the cost of encouraging North Korea's nascent economic reforms that have apparently started late last year under Kim Jong-un and boosted this year by a new premier who has a track record of economic reform. The People's Liberation Army, the Chinese military, is traditionally supportive of North Korea and the main perpetuator of this concept of North Korea as a strategic buffer that we hear so much about. However, this buffer concept is increasingly questioned within the Chinese system overall, and indeed may be irrelevant to the PLA's own military posture and capabilities, which have evolved away from a land war in Korea and towards a more ocean-going maritime approach to the South China Sea and other territorial issues on China's borders. Indeed, the cost of China's support for North Korea is primarily felt by the PLA, and specifically the 2nd Artillery, the nuclear forces, due to the U.S. military deployments and specifically missile defense. The deployment of 16 additional missile interceptors to Alaska in response to North Korea's third nuclear test and the December 2012 missile launch theoretically would impact China's second strike capability and damage the 2nd Artillery's effectiveness for Chinese military. An important factor to watch within the PLA itself is the intra-bureaucratic competition, in the sense that if the PLA army continues to lose influence in the future, there is a possibility for an overall PLA shift toward a more second artillery and thus U.S.-centric approach. However, this is not currently happening. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as the external-facing department of the Chinese government, is most likely the actor most likely supporting this perceived shift within the Chinese government. However, they're generally weaker and increasingly weaker within the Chinese system, and it'll be interesting to watch how Yang Jiechi balances Ministry of Foreign Affairs power within the system against International Liaison Department and the People's Liberation Army's traditional influence over North Korea policy. A couple more to quickly watch would be the provincial governments, who have a general stake in economic reform and would thus oppose a policy shift. This goes along with the Ministry of Commerce and Chinese businesses, who all have a great economic stake in North Korea. Chinese academics have been one of the main kind of observable indicators for this Western perception of a Chinese shift. These are most evident in Fudan Professor Shunning Li's article in Foreign Policy, Dong Yuwen's article in Financial Times, and even Zhang Linggui's statement in Global Times. Shun and Deng called for China to abandon North Korea, and Zhang said that the Xi Jinping administration has actually already decided that denuclearization is now prioritized above stability, which is something that has never been said for China's policy before. However, I would personally suggest that foreign observers need to be careful not to assign these specific academics as representing specific government factions or bureaucracies within the Chinese system, and instead reflecting the overall tenor of the debate within the government. And so the question is, with all these actors coming together, what is the one actor that's most likely to influence China's policy from outside? And again, I would suggest that it's the U.S. I would suggest that China's long-term policy is driven in part by the U.S.-China relations, including this rebalancing of the pivot to Asia and a fear of U.S. containment, and North Korea as a bargaining chip and also just simply a strategic buffer in that sense. And even China's short-term policy is likely in part a reaction to the U.S. response to North Korea, specifically U.S. military deployments in the region and U.S. missile defense. This would suggest that if there is indeed a shift, it is more likely to be a short-term adjustment to the U.S. response rather than a long-term reassessment of China's overall national interests on the Korean Peninsula. So what does this mean going forward? What are reasonable expectations of Chinese actions in the future? I would suggest that China's belief in this paradox of influence over North Korea means that China is largely unwilling to put enough pressure on North Korea to change what the world is most worried about: nuclear weapons and the missile program. While the Chinese government does indeed, in terms of absolute influence, wield enough power to cripple, if not topple, the North Korean regime. However, because of the Chinese willingness to threaten the Kim regime's stability, it means that practically the influence is limited to likely restraining North Korea to have less provocations and more in line with 2011, where instead of the 2010 attacks on South Korea and the 2012 missile launch and 2013 nuclear test, 2011 is mostly focusing on economic reform or economic progress and trade with China. So looking forward, I think that these reports of increased sanctions enforcement and diplomatic pressure on North Korea from China suggest that possibly there is some kind of a short-term minor adjustment going for Chinese policy. However, there is indeed more evidence needed for a wider judgment on the fundamental shift in China's policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. I think it was useful to have your description of the various actors in China that are involved in policy calculations, your description of the various audiences of Chinese policy. We also had a discussion about the degree to which the US can influence and to some extent shape the wider context in which the Chinese make the calculations that they will ultimately make in respect to their relations with North Korea. In the discussion period, we can perhaps, I think, touch a little bit on how the North Koreans define and manage their relationship with China, the degree to which they seek to engage interest groups within China, the extent to which they understand what sort of parameters that they can act within, what lines they must not cross, which lines it would be tempting to nudge against in order to produce certain reactions from time to time. Well, we have about 20 minutes or so for questions, and Edwina Morton was the first to catch my eye.
On the issue of, thank you very much for the three very interesting insights. On the cost-benefit analysis point, you've alluded to, two of you have alluded to the problems that Chinese have with the US pivot. But I wonder if you could reflect a little bit wider or deeper than that in the region. It's hard to imagine that anything North Korea has done with the missile tests and the nuclear tests has helped China in its relations with South Korea or Japan. It's driven both countries to a much closer military relationship with the US, particularly Japan. And I wonder, how far does one go ahead with, more missile tests, more nuclear tests, before the Chinese figure out that actually the damage done to their strategy for dealing with their neighbors is really quite severe. So that's the first question. The second is, the Chinese constantly say, they want people to get back to six-party talks. It's entirely understandable from that point of view, because if they could do that, then the other countries around the table, South Korea, Japan, and the US, would share some of the responsibility as well for dealing with North Korean behavior. In actual fact, six-party talks got us nowhere. So is there any value in going back to them?
You want to tackle that?
Sure. To start with the second one first. In terms of this, I think that what I find interesting about this, whether or not there is a shift in terms of how the Chinese are dealing with this and how they've been perceiving the six-party talks, what I find striking is that despite the fact that, for all intents and purposes, all of the discussions that I was privy to within the country, prior to this last test, I said the six-party talks will not work. We don't want to necessarily get back into that process again. And I heard more Americans coming to Beijing and saying we need to have more discussions. We need to get back to the negotiating table. So it was almost like a reversal of roles, at least from my vantage point. But I felt that there was a lot of pessimism about it within China leading up to this latest call. But unfortunately, I think that they perceive it as probably the only one route that you can pursue. I mean, there's not a lot of other options on the table, at least into their mind, that will be peaceful or have a peaceful outcome. And it still gives them that important role, that central role. And that's why I think a lot of people I've noticed within the discussion domestically continue to support it. But do they necessarily see it going anywhere? No, I think it's pretty much just staving off the worst option, which would be God only knows what. In terms of the cost-benefit analysis in the U.S. pivot, I think that obviously, in terms of where the Chinese see the region headed and more tests and more nuclear tests in the future, and what that tipping point would be is hard to say. Whether or not it's the fifth test, the sixth test, or what have you. I definitely think that there has been a tendency to see how it's working against their interests. I mean, they recognize this fact. But the fact that all of the literature that I see within the country, all the discussions I've had with people, whether they be PLA, whether they be otherwise, and I should have mentioned at the beginning, I for this particular talk, I downloaded about 1,000 articles, and I skimmed through them to see what was mentioned the most. And what was mentioned the most in articles having to do with North Korea was still U.S. pursuit of regional and global hegemony, the balance, this rebalancing, containing China's emergence. And I don't think these are just talking points. And I think that there is this perception that Japan and South Korea are being used against, that it's the U.S. using them. It's not North Korea turning them against China or against the region or creating these problems. I find that actually they tend to talk about this as U.S. destabilization to this day, and still talking about this idea of the United States seeking for excuses to penetrate the region more fulsomely.
Do you guys want to come in?
Sure. I'll tackle the first question you had about when is China finally going to wake up and rethink its policy. I think that my point about the bureaucratic inertia within the Chinese system, I think it's possibly hard for people outside of the system to understand just to such an extent that it exists. To give an example, after North Korea's first nuclear test in 2006, it took a while for China to respond to the test. And indeed, Hu Jintao himself reportedly wrote that statement. So we're saying in a country of 1.3 billion people, no other person had the power or authority to address the North Korean nuclear test other than the men at the top. That is what I would call massive bureaucratic inertia, that no one below him had the authority or simply even the guts to just take that statement on and issue it. It had to be Hu Jintao personally writing that statement. And so when Laura mentioned that he called North Korea brazen or flagrant, that was specifically language inserted by Hu Jintao. So I think that's a really indication, the massive bureaucratic inertia that inhibits China from rethinking its policy and really keeps it on the same track that it has been going before. Every test, there's a discussion in the West about, is China going to rethink its policy? And I think, for about 2 or 3 months afterward, we're always excited that, there's this statement or there's this statement, and this person said this person has done this, and does this mean what we hope it means? Is there really a shift? In 2009, reportedly, the Politburo Standing Committee even took kind of an informal vote, and it ended up being 5-4 in favor of continued support for North Korea. Now, I would not suggest this is a Supreme Court-style swing vote, but I would suggest that if that indeed did take place, the policy itself is obviously still in favor of the traditional support for North Korea. And obviously, I haven't personally heard any reports of that happening again this year. It's more likely under Xi Jinping that there could be a rethink, newer generation, arguably less ties to North Korea, but then again, his father's own talking about legacy politics, his father's own legacy is indeed tied to North Korea. So there really are, I think, many questions about whether or not the Chinese government is able to or willing to rethink that policy and what it will take. I think that after the first test and second test, now our third test, if there's indeed no shifts coming now, short of having a demonstrated nuclear weapons capability on top of an ICBM, I don't see what else would radically change China's policy in terms of security costs that would make them reconsider it.
John Hemmings?
John Hemmings, policy PhD. Just wondering, to what extent to the panel at large, is there been a shift, or do you see support for a shift in the Chinese positioning from the old lips and teeth, warm relationship to a new kind of resource extraction or far more strategic, maybe cold, calculated support, so that there is a shift, but it's one that at the end of the day the results don't change much. Can you see support for that narrative at all?
Okay. We'll take another question from in the second row.
Costello from Washington, Asia East. This is very refreshing to hear after listening to the discussions in Washington for the last couple of decades. In particular, though, I'd like to focus on the South Korea contribution here. Leading up to the final regime changes at the end of 2012, many of us thought that the South Korean presidential election was the one that could really tip the balance. The new South Korean president was the one who had both the interest on the one hand and the political flexibility on the other to make a play with China and North Korea, which could change the game a bit. Because it went with Park Geun-hye, it is a little bit less likely that they'll do anything terribly interesting. As we saw with the visit to Beijing, Ms. Park is sticking pretty closely to the previous South Korean regime's playbook. And she's so closely allied with President Obama that it seems it may be impossible for her to do that. But maybe the real question here is to look at in terms of time frames and in terms of sequencing. To talk about the idea that the Chinese have taken the idea of denuclearization and made it less important, I think is a bit of a misnomer, because denuclearization is what they've always wanted. The real question is whether the U.S. side will begin to have a less shallow and a more long-term policy. To wind up, we're the ones in the short end of this time sequence. We have 4 years. The South Koreans have 5. The Chinese have 10, and Kim Jong-un might be in power for 40 years. So they're playing a longer game, and we can't seem to get a longer one themselves in Washington.
Okay, who wants to start?
I'd like to address both of the questions just simply by talking about how China's talking about North Korea. The discourse has shifted a lot, and we can't mistake that for policy change, obviously. But I would argue that if you look at from the North Korean perspective in particular, I think that the Park Geun-hye visit is more worrying than it might seem at first glance. I think that she has a much more skillful approach to undermining support for North Korea in Chinese public opinion, for example. Again, how much does that matter is the question. But in talking about history, returning the remnants of the Korean War, etc., and in the meantime, Kim Jong-un is about to make the Chinese really mad. They have a brand new Korean War museum, massively resourced. It looks like the Titanic or something. in Pyongyang, and there's probably nothing about China. And so he's done a very poor job of managing that relationship. And to come back to how they talk about one another, resource extraction we could debate, but this kind of anti-Kim discussion, anti-Kim Il-sung discussion, anti-Kim family discussion, it's not just somebody said something nasty on Weibo. I mean, there are long journal articles now in party history journals about how Kim Il-sung has been sticking it to China from the beginning. And not just with the Korean War, but through the 50s and 60s, really misusing. So I think that that's going to make North Korea less pliant to Chinese overtures. I have no answer, though, about this sort of, the alignment of South and sort of Seineuriadong, et cetera. I mean, how much change can you expect?
Just briefly to touch upon, because I think you did a great job answering that. So what I'll do is I'll cover the gaps. I think that when we talk about denuclearization, I want to take issue with whether or not China has always had it in its interest for denuclearization, because I still think that strongly when and this is something North Korea plays to, the idea that if you denuclearize, you will be overthrown. Look at Libya, look at Iraq. I mean, this is, and from people that I know within the country who receive delegations of North Koreans coming, North Koreans are very well aware of this. So they mentioned this history, right? If you look at the North Korean statements that came out just after their test, that they only would pursue denuclearization or getting rid of their nuclear weapons once the world achieved global disarmament. Who else said that? China said that. China's whole approach to saying we need nuclear weapons in order to achieve global disarmament. It's textbook old China, a textbook. And so I think that they play to that. And so I don't know that necessarily the Chinese are fully comfortable with the idea of a denuclearized peninsula if it means that the regime is overthrown and if it leads to instability. Because I still think there is a strong priority there. I do think that the discussion's changing, most definitely. In terms of the lips and teeth, if we're talking about changes in that regard as well, it's interesting because I think that there is actually, predating Kim Jong-un, there's been a concern about North Korea. It's kind of like the relationship with Pakistan. I actually work on South Asia more than I work on this part of the world. But what's striking to me about it is the fact that, for example, I do a lot of interpreting, and I've done interpreting at events since, basically, I've been working on this since about 2000. And in that interpreting, I still remember vividly doing this interpretation at a major conference. Joel Witt was there, this whole group talking about North Korea. And the Chinese experts in the room who are pretty high ranking, one of them used the word ta, and just referring to the country, which could be anything. It could be the United States, it could be North Korea, and basically said, we don't trust them. We think that we're going to head in one direction and they'll head in the other, and they will burn us. And I translated it as the United States, and they said, no, we're talking about North Korea. Now that was in 2002, and I'm sure that also if you look at far enough back, and if you talk about it with people as well, I think that lips and teeth thing is really papering over a much more rooted sense of distrust that's actually there, whether or not they want to talk about it or not.
Gingivitis and tooth decay. You by the mirror there? Yeah.
But yeah, Ingvar Silkepersky at the King's College, it's sort of echoing the other question we had. And it's for Laura Salmon again, the question.
Oh.
So you think that the non-proliferation and counter-proliferation policies of the United States in the past, say, 20 years on Iraq, Iran, and North Korea did not have such a big effect on Chinese non-proliferation thinking? And how far is that also influenced the handling of the United States on non-proliferation and counter-proliferation?
Well, actually, I think that they had a marked impact on the Chinese view of proliferation and counter-proliferation, right? And the actual pitfalls of engaging, especially in counter-proliferation. If you actually look at how China, within China, just historically, when they talk about arms control, non-proliferation, and counter-proliferation, they see them on a continuum of basically, they're most comfortable with using arms control, 军备控制, because it's basically about the responsibility of non-nuclear weapon states and nuclear weapon states. Everybody has a responsibility. Non-proliferation is about keeping nuclear weapons out of the hands of the non-nuclear weapon states, right? It's more about them. Well, there's still some degree to which a nuclear power has the responsibility not to transfer that technology. Counterproliferation is about forcibly taking, taking measures to keep, if necessary, to keep it out of other people's hands, using interdiction, using all of these very aggressive means if necessary. That is least liked, I would say, within China. And so they will point, obviously, to Iraq, they'll point to Libya, and they will say, look exactly what happened to these countries that then had their potential programs taken away from them. It is that what you necessarily want to see on the peninsula. So I think that I think that their view is very much shaped by the United States over time.
Yes, please.
How is Libya, sorry, it's Cornelius Fokker, I'm a member of the Institute. How is Libya cited as an example? Because didn't Libya make a big show of abandoning its WMD system, its research there?
Right.
So how does Libya factor into the Chinese narrative?
Sure. And I group them together because they're commonly within China, and when people use them, they cite them together. But obviously, they're two different cases in the sense that Libya gave those capabilities up, right? But the fact remains is it doesn't matter if it was, if they were forcibly taken away from it or not. The end game, the end result is Muammar Gaddafi is no longer with us, among us. And I think that is exactly what they think might happen. Even if say, it's even the worst case scenario for North Korea, right? It moves along this path, and then its leadership is not just forcibly deposed, but actually worse.
Yes, please.
Pete, Woman from the MOD. I'm interested in an article I read fairly recently about the increasing low levels of trade between China and North Korea, raising awareness of the population of living conditions outside, specifically things like DVDs, etc. How aware is China that China's paradox, as it were, that it's increasing trade with the North is a destabilizing activity within that region?
Want to take that on?
I think they trust the North Koreans to control their own people, and I think they trust the public security bureaus cross-border. I think there's a lot of communication. There was a great article written in German a couple of years ago by a guy named Stefan Blanke, who lives in Berlin at Freie Universität Berlin, and he basically lays out how these public security bureaus are in close contact and close coordination, and it's not just refugees. There's also overseas Chinese who have more than 10,000 living in the northern tier of the DPRK. Kim Jong-un has allowed them all to have phones, not cell phones, but landlines to their homes, and that's liberalization. I don't think they're worried about that. I think what they are worried about are industrial accidents, things that nuclear, that I don't think is just rhetoric when the Chinese talk about a possible nuclear accident or contamination. In DPRK, and in the same way that they look at their own people, I think they can see that destabilization in that frame could be very, very harmful, and they'd be certainly willing to move in and contain it and to extend the jump over the border maybe to do that. But as far as this kind of undergirding being corroded away, yuanization, I think, is a problem, right? You're talking about something like 80% of, we don't have really good figures, but people using foreign currency because they just simply do not trust in North Korea their own currency since 2002 and again in 2009. So, it's pernicious. But when it comes to Chinese culture, crossing the border, and we talked about Sinwiju and Dandong, they don't even allow Chinese businessmen into Sinwiju to have their own cell phones. So there was all this stuff about foreigners being able to do their Instagram, and Jean Lee and the AP having a ball saying how liberal things have become in Pyongyang. Chinese business people trying to cross the border don't even have phones, are not allowed to operate in that way. So I would say that they keep a pretty tight leash. As I think Andrei Lankov said this, the blade of state is still suitably sharp to cut off the diseased parts. I would subscribe to that.
And if I could just weigh in just briefly on that, because I think that you had some excellent insights today. I learned a great deal from listening to you, but one of the things that really resonated with me is the fact that we're talking about sanctions, we're talking about China coming on board with these things and what kind of impact that would have. I think what we end up talking about the most are all these logistical obstacles, to greater cooperation, whether it's flooding or the fact that whether or not it's actually feasible, whether it's the political relationship between the two countries. It's not about the fact that the sanctions are actually, working or not working. It's just about the logistical and the relationship between the two parties, rather than anything else we've talked about today. Thank you.
Final comment on that, and then we'll have the last question.
Thank you. I wanted to talk about your point about trade and kind of this eroding of North Korean cultural values. I think that it's important to note that China's interest in trade is obviously self-serving, in the sense that I think China also hopes that its trade with North Korea is infectious in the sense that it promotes economic reforms within North Korea. So again, the Chinese provinces and the central government have a massive stake in promoting North Korean economic reform, in at least the sense that opening the mineral resources and economic opportunities to Chinese companies, especially for the poor kind of Rust Belt northeast provinces of Jilin and Liaoning and also Heilongjiang. And I think that it's interesting that the Politburo Standing Committee, especially Wen Jiabao himself, has really made it known that the trade flow will be market forces. So they have not had actually a lot of central government direct investment in North Korea. It's been mainly led by the provinces and facilitated by the provinces, with the roads and all the infrastructure investment that Laura talked about, were mainly provincial level investments, not Beijing-led activities. So I think that it's interesting to note that China has a very self-serving interest in this trade and wants to promote this trade and isn't as worried about the trade, in a sense, impacting North Korea's legitimacy for the Kim regime, because China itself went through that process, right? So China, all the time you hear, oh, North Korea is China 30 years ago. And so in that sense, they wouldn't be worried about trade because China itself has survived this kind of infusion of capitalism with socialist values. And I think that talking about sanctions enforcement is interesting, again, to go back to the bureaucratic politics discussion, in the sense that one of the biggest ministries who promotes trade with North Korea is obviously the Ministry of Commerce, but they're also the ones primarily responsible for enforcing many of the sanctions that China is supposed to be enacting against North Korea. So you had this bureaucratic competition, or this, overlaying incentive that you want to promote trade, but at the same time you're supposed to be limiting trade in these certain aspects. And I think that's quite difficult for a bureaucracy to do when your main task for China is to promote economic growth. I mean, how are you supposed to be responsible to the United Nations and other countries for enforcing sanctions?
Good point. And finally?
Samir Puri, member of the Institute, just finished a PhD touching on modern applications of coercion theory. The impression I'm left with after hearing your three presentations is that a steady evolution in Chinese policy towards North Korea is less likely than China's policy shifting in relation to crisis de-escalation and it being forced to act, forced to intervene. Kind of educated crystal ball gazing, I guess, is what I'm asking for, especially from Nathan, is what scale of crisis can actually provoke a lasting change in China's engagement with North Korea, something transformatory of Chinese engagement in a sort of longer standing period of time?
I think that if you look at historically what's happened since 1994, the first nuclear crisis, China did not play a very active role in that, even though that was potentially a massive event on the Korean Peninsula. If you go to 2002, 2003, when China started the six-party talks, within President George Bush's the second autobiography, he mentioned a discussion with Jiang Zemin, and that they were walking together, and he told Jiang that, if North Korea can't come to the bargaining table, the negotiating table about this nuclear issue, I, George Bush, may be forced to consider some kind of a military strike on North Korea. And the next sentence of the book is, and 6 months later, the six-party talks happened. So, it seems to me that George Bush is making the inference that his kind of blatant threat to China in terms of North Korea's as a strategic buffer seemed to work. And whether or not that was actually the tipping point for the six-party talks, or whether it was China simply being afraid of this black box on its border, almost having a nuclear weapon, that could equally be the issue. But maybe something along those lines of just a United States government, more or less direct threat against Chinese interests, would be something to force a change in Chinese policy. But I think that it's important to balance the coercion versus cooperation, right? So if you have coercion, I think it's easier to coerce China for a short-term change in policy, but that won't be a lasting change. I think the only way to have a real lasting change for Chinese policy toward the peninsula is likely to be cooperation and fomenting that trust, because as we talked about, the U.S. is really a big factor in China's policy, and if the U.S. is the one coercing China to change policy short-term, how is that supposed to kind of promote a sense of trust, strategic trust of the U.S., and that China doesn't need North Korea as a strategic buffer for the pivot to Asia, and it doesn't need North Korea as an affront against, U.S. interests in the region. And that if you're coercing China to change policy long term, I think that has deleterious effects on the overall U.S.-China relationship.
And if I could just chime in on one thing there, because I actually 2 points. The first about the more economic interaction. I think that that's exactly what China wants. I think that's exactly what they've been talking about with the SEZs, is this idea of soft power, right? Changing the way people think, and that you have to have economic ties in order to do that. On this crisis issue, you know, because this is from the Chinese viewpoint, actually, and it's interesting you mentioned the Bush quote. I make the argument all the time that I think China is really operating crisis by crisis for a lot of this. They're doing it with Iran as well. I could talk about Iran case as well. But in the North Korean case, if you look in the lead up to the six-party talks, 2003, they were referring to it as a 核危机, which is a nuclear crisis. Now, normally when they talk about it, they call it the 核问题, you know, so it's like an issue, you know, the nuclear issue, the nuclear problem, right? And so, but right at that pivot, you know, right at that point, they were talking about the United States potentially conducting an attack, doing this or that, you know, intervening in some way that was destabilizing to the region, and they used the term crisis. So I think that there is some credence, you know, as Bush said, perhaps to this idea that, yeah, they're reacting to the United States. And I find that across the board. I think they're much more reacting to the United States than to any individual case of proliferation.
I just have two quick
sure.
additions.
Final
I think Japan is the one to watch in terms of coercing China. I mean, this is reading all kinds of media about, you read a headline about the Diaoyu issue, you scroll down a little bit, they're talking about the self-defense forces coming back, it's about Diaoyu, they want to push us down there. In fact, the text of the article, a lot of it's about they're responding to North Korea as well, and I think that sort of going back to the early Cold War and Japanese rearmament, I mean, a lot of those core issues, this is part of what we are all dealing with, is the legacies of the 40s and 50s. I mean, that whole notion of, is Japan America's chip or not? I mean, we've talked about North Korea as China's chip, but that's, you want to talk about coercion of China. I mean, that's the place to go for the United States if you want to go that route. I think it's dangerous for a lot of reasons. Secondly, as far as crisis management, a lot of figures floating around. There's some figures from Monterey. 2.4 to 4.1 North Korean refugees will flood into China in the event of a Korean War II. My archival research says that back in the 1950-51, 10,000 in the Northeast, 10,000 in the Northwest, max. I mean, these are small numbers. And look at China's crisis management today. You know, look along the border with Myanmar, et cetera. Look at the technological capabilities. I don't think they're so worried about that. So if you're looking for leverage against China, we're going to let the refugees loose, you know, set up refugee camps in Mongolia, et cetera. I mean, I think they're less worried about that than we might think. So.
Well, thanks very much indeed. It seems to me that some of the sort of structural underlying issues in this whole dilemma are fairly static and unchanging, but as your presentations demonstrated, there's a lot of interesting nuance which is being thrown up, and I think is certainly very much worth keeping a track of. Before drawing things to a close, I just want to remind people that we've got a couple of additional events this week. Ben Barry, who's our Senior Fellow for Land Warfare, has been to Afghanistan for a week or so, and he's going to be debriefing us on Thursday, the 11th, at lunchtime. And then the following lunchtime on Friday, we're going to have an event looking at the Iranian elections that we had recently. And then next week, there's an evening event to coincide with a book launch, British Generals in Blair's War, and Hugh Strawn, who's the Chichley Professor of the History of War All Souls and also a member of the ISS Council, is going to be leading a discussion that also includes Sir Nick Parker, the former Deputy Commander of Coalition Forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that takes place from 5:30 on Wednesday, the 17th of July, and everybody's very welcome to attend that. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking our speakers today. Thanks very much indeed.